So you might have noticed that in that last module, I kind of skipped over one of the object types, and that object type was functions. And that's because I wanted to devote actually a separate module to how functions work in R and some tricks for troubleshooting when they don't work the way that you hoped. So let's start by talking about this object called a function. Now I want to remind you of some important facts that you learned about R last week. So you learned that R is an open source language. That means that anyone can contribute to it, anyone can write code for it, anyone can add to its functionality. And so the power of R comes from these packages. And these packages are just things that other people in the community have written that define new functions, that give you new stuff that you can do. And so fact 3 that I'm giving you today is that R is what's called a functional programming language, which is a formal computer science term, but really it just means that it is designed for you to use and write functions, including writing your own. You don't have to write a whole package in order to write your own function, and in fact in a couple weeks we'll be writing our own functions in this class. But for now I want to talk about kind of how a function is structured and how you can go about troubleshooting. So here's an example, a very simple function. You may not have seen it before, but I hope you can infer a little bit from looking at it what's going on. So this function is generating 10 random samples from a normal distribution, and specifically the normal distribution with a mean of 5 and a standard deviation of 3. And so we've given R some information. We've given it how many samples we want, what we want the mean to be, and what we want the standard deviation to be, and it's spitting back to us this vector of random samples. So let's talk about the pieces of this function. The first piece is, of course, the name of the function. In this case, it's rnorm for random normal. Now that name is chosen by whoever wrote the function, and they can choose whatever they want. So I want you to be a little bit careful. You might come across a function on the internet and you think it's doing what you hoped because the name of the function feels like it should do that. That won't always be true. Really, a function can have any name at all. But hopefully your functions that you write and that you will be using will have informative and reasonable names, such as this one, random normal is rnorm. The next element is the required arguments. Now most functions in R, you have to at least give them a little bit of information so that they know what you're asking them to do. And so the arguments that the function actually has to have in order to operate are the required ones. So in this case, the only required argument is 10. Is the number of samples that we are pulling from a normal distribution. You might ask yourself, what happens if we only give it that first argument, if we don't give it a mean or a standard deviation? There's some ways that you can find in the documentation what's going on. You might try $rnorm to snoop this out. If you want to try that, and I suggest you do, you could pause here and give it some thought, but I'll give you the answer in a moment. But in any case, if you leave off those next two, mean and standard deviation, and you just say rnorm 10, that will not break. That is enough information for the rnorm function to produce something that you are looking for. And so you can often tell what's going on when you look at someone else's code. By convention, you don't usually reference the names of these arguments when it's a required argument. So technically I could have written rnorm and then put n equals 10, n being the number of samples that I want. But in this case I haven't, and for the most part people drop that off for the required arguments. But now there are these other two arguments, mean and standard deviation. And for these two with the optional arguments, you should always use the argument names. And sometimes that's a little annoying, you have to check what the names are. Once again, these names are chosen by the person who wrote the function, and so sometimes you'll see an argument and you'll hope it does something, or you'll kind of assume that an argument exists, and in fact, the way that the person who has written the function has named it is slightly different. But if that argument is available in the construction of the function, then you can input it in the parentheses here, and you should always use the name if this is an optional argument. Now in this case, as many of you probably inferred, if you leave off mean or you leave off standard deviation, you're going to use the standard normal, a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So you don't have to specify, but if you want to override those defaults, that's when you specify these optional arguments. So let's talk about troubleshooting some common errors with functions, maybe some strategies for approaching these problems. The first thing to look for is what we call a syntax error. It kind of just means a typo. So a common one is forgetting a parentheses. Now in this case, it's very easy to spot the missing parentheses. But as you get more and more complex in this class, you may find that you have functions inside functions inside functions, and then it can be hard to keep track of how many parentheses you're supposed to have and where they go. So a good first thing to check is for these parentheses. And you can see here the error that we're getting is unexpected end of input. Basically it's saying, look, I got to the end of this line of code, still didn't find that end parentheses that I was looking for. I didn't expect to hit the end before seeing a parentheses. Another common syntax error is commas. You might have caught this one. I hope you caught this one in your practice assignment. And so here we've got our first argument, which is 10, our second argument, which is mean equals 5, but alas, I have forgotten the comma between them. And so R is very confused. R has an unexpected symbol. It goes do-do-do, I see a 10, I know what to do. Now I see the word mean. Ooh, I don't know what to do with that. I thought I was going to get a comma, but instead I got this word mean. So it's not the most helpful error message, but if you see an unexpected symbol error message, nearly always means a missing comma. And then last but not least, simple typos. I do this all the time. In fact, I use this function as an example because this is one of my #1 errors in R. I am always trying to generate nrom samples instead of nnorm or rnorm samples. I don't know why. I don't know why my brain doesn't want those to be in the right order. You will probably find your own little bugaboos that you run into. But if you're getting some kind of could not find that function or could not find that object and you're like, I swear this function exists, I know this function exists, maybe you just typoed it, so check your spelling. And then once you've checked for those kind of simple, very common typo errors, a good type of error to look for is the object type error. By which I mean, are you inputting the right type and structure? So functions are written to handle certain inputs, right? Not every function is working with the same type of data input. And so here I've done something very silly. I've said, please give me random normal samples. Well, how many do you want, Kelly? I would like high. That makes no sense whatsoever. R is very confused, I'm very confused. You're looking at my screen going, wow, I'm spending the time to watch this video, and Kelly's trying to take high samples. But we can see it gave a warning, and then it was like, I'm gonna keep trying, and then it's like, oh, I gave an error. This is an invalid argument. High is not a valid type of argument input to this function. And these types of errors will not always be quite this straightforward, and they won't necessarily trigger this helpful invalid argument message. Something else might break first. And so a good thing to check is that the input that the function expects really is what you're giving it. And again, you can do that question mark trick to look at the documentation to figure out which types a certain function wants. You'll get used to this as you go. And you also want to make sure that you are understanding the output of this function. So here, are you not just giving it the right input, but is the thing that it's giving back to you being used properly? So here I've said, let me make an object called myObject, and let me make that object be a vector with 10 random normal samples. And then I've said, please give me the 5th element of that vector, but alas, I had a bit of a brain fart, and I accidentally put round parentheses instead of square brackets. And so R is saying here, look, I can't find a function called myObject. I see these parentheses, that tells me I'm trying to run a function, but there is no function by that name. So here I made this object, which is a vector, and then I accidentally tried to use it as a function. Now this is kind of a silly example, but as we'll see later on in this week and throughout the course, some of these functions that work with data sets, sometimes they return an adjusted data set, sometimes they return just one variable from the data set, and mixing and matching those things can lead you to a lot of problems. So every time that you come to me with a question, I will probably ask you, what input did the function want? What output did the function give? And if you can tell me that data type and you can tell me that structure, and those are consistent, then we can move on to the next bit of troubleshooting. So let's close out here with some thoughts about how to deal with the messages that you get from R. Now, just because you see some red text, it's red for most people in their little console screen, this does not mean that something went wrong. R likes to talk to you, it's very chatty, If something happens, sometimes it wants to give you a message and let you know what's going on. You'll often see this when you load up the tidyverse, so you can go ahead and try that now if you haven't already loaded it, or maybe reference back to some of your old work. When you load up the tidyverse, it will often give you a bunch of messages about which packages got loaded and what their status is and what's going on. And a lot of people see this when they first start out and they think, oh gosh, there's colors, there's messages, I did something wrong. Not necessarily. If you see text output, regardless of what color it is, it's sometimes just R giving you some helpful information, trying to be supportive. Now there are some bad messages or messages that should give you pause. One of them is a warning. And so what a warning means, it means your code did run. It did finish the process you asked it to do, and it did its best. But you should probably double check and make sure that it did exactly what you wanted. So here's an example. I've made a vector that contains 3 strings or 3 character values, A, B, and C. And then I've tried to make a new vector that was an integer version of my vec. And we've seen this work on Booleans, we've seen this work on factors, but now I'm throwing it at this character vector. And it doesn't really make sense, right? There's not a way to turn A into a number. And so it gives me this warning, and that warning says, NA is induced by coercion. And so it's telling me I tried. It's telling me I ran your code, I did make something. I did make you my new vector. It just might not be what you intended. So if we check out my new vector, we can see that all that it did is it said, I want to turn A into an integer, but I can't, so missing value, NA, not applicable. Now I want to turn B into an integer, also can't do it. And then you get na Batman. That's what I hear in my head every time I see these NAs. Sometimes I hear that, and sometimes I hear Rihanna. Oh, na, na, what's my name? Oh, na, na, what's my name? So, what happened here? We had a warning, right? It did create the new vector, but what it did was not very helpful, and so it's saying, probably this isn't what you wanted. I did what you asked, but you probably didn't want it. Compare that to an error. So as opposed to a warning, if you get an error, something went bad, something went wrong, you have a problem you need to fix. This means that it could not finish running your code. It did not do the thing that you asked it to do. So here's an example. My vector is ABC. I try to make a new vector by adding 1. So when I said, please turn this into an integer, it was like, I tried. But when I don't even do that step, I'm just like, please calculate A plus 1. R is like, no way. I cannot handle that. I cannot add 1 to A. I will not. And it returns this error instead. It did not create for you my new vector. Now I know that these error messages are sometimes a little obtuse. They're sometimes kind of computer sciencey speak. They don't necessarily tell you where the errors are. And so I want to tell you about a few of the most common error messages. But of course, as you go in R, as you get more used to it, you will get familiar with some of them, or at least you will figure out how to snoop out the problems yourself. So here's a common one. If R says to you, error, object not found. Object, the name of something, not found. What this probably means is that you have not yet created that object. So if you thought you had an object created, but then you restarted R and you didn't actually rerun your old code, and so that object no longer exists in your environment, and then you try to use it, and R is like, sorry, I can't find that thing you're asking me to use. Another option that this might mean, a reason why R can't find the thing that you're asking it to use, is if you have a typo in the name. So this is another source where if you switch a couple letters, it can be infuriating. If you see this error, double check that the object that you actually have in your environment is spelled the same as the object that you're trying to use in your code. And by the way, capital letters do matter. And so here's a very silly example. I have some object, I have accidentally typoed in my creation of the object, and so when I tried to use it later, R is like, nope, haven't seen anything by that name hanging around, because it's not smart enough to realize that that was a typo. Here is an error message that is actually kind of a big joke in the community. This is one of everyone's favorite thing to make fun of in R, because it's a very straightforward error that is expressed in the least helpful way possible. And that error is object of type closure is not subsettable. That probably meant nothing to you. It meant nothing to me until about last year. But I did know that if I saw this, then I should check for my object names. So what this probably means is that you tried to use square brackets instead of curly brackets on a function. Let me show you. So here, if I've said I want to take the mean of the numbers 1 and 2, beginners often, as they're getting used to function structure, will try something like this. Now, mean is a function. It's a function that's built into R. It has one required argument, and that argument is a vector. It wants some numbers that it can calculate the mean of. But of course here, I've used those square brackets, like that. And those square brackets say, oh, I'm trying to subset, I'm trying to access a certain element of a matrix. But mean is not a matrix, it is a function, or a closure is the word for function for some reason in R. And so R says, sorry, I cannot take the subset of a function, that makes no sense. Now where I run into this the most often is where I thought I've defined an object and I haven't, so the same error as object not found, except that it just so happens that the name of the object is also a function in R. So I didn't realize that function existed, I thought I had an object by the name, I thought I was using that object, but in fact I'm accidentally using a function. It's very strange, but if you see this error, then look around for those square brackets and make sure the thing that's getting bracketed really is an object that can be bracketed, like a matrix. Lastly, the other most common one I see is this non-numeric argument to binary operator. Again, lots of fancy words that just means you tried to do math on data that was a word. Literally, that's all this means. So we just saw an example earlier on. Here's an even simpler one. I'm trying to add 2 to A, and R says, no way, I can't do math on the letter A. And then it gives you this very formal non-numeric argument to binary operator. Thank you, R. Really, you just can't add. So in this case, where I run into this one is usually I used the wrong variable name and I accidentally used a categorical variable instead of quantitative. Or I tried to add 2 things that I didn't mean to be adding, I meant to be doing something else with them. Just check for where you're doing math operations and make sure everything that's being mathed on really is a numeric object type. So with those 3 common ones in your pocket, those are not the only error messages you're going to run into, of course, that's how it goes. When all else fails, Googling the error message is a good idea, like literally copy-pasting the text of the error message. Leave out the specifics, so if you had, object Kelly not found, don't include the Kelly because that's specific to your code, but search for something like object not found. And sometimes it can be helpful if you know which function caused the error to include that function. So if you're using a complicated function and you get an obtuse error, if you Google the text of that error alongside the name of that function, sometimes you'll find someone else who had the same problem. And so let me just give you something to try before I send you on your way. So here I have some code, it's throwing an error. What is the problem with this code?